Well, hello, Hub City. Pastor Sean here. I wish we could be gathered together today. Unfortunately, as you all understand, things changed. Thankfully, we have the technology to be able to do this way, and our hope is that we're able to utilize our resources to be able to continue to engage, encountering Jesus together, growing together. Just it's going to look a little bit different. And so today, we're going to kick off a new series called Origins. And when we talk about origins, it makes you think about family trees. And I don't know about you, if you are really into this sort of thing. My dad was. He was one that really gets into, who's uncle, who's friend, who's aunt, and, grandfather, and all of these things. And he would spend time in libraries studying historical documents. This was before Google, obviously. I don't know if any of you were like that, or you had relatives who were, and they wanted to kind of map out how everything was. I even remember one time, he took us to a cemetery, me and my half-brother and step-siblings, and he handed us a name and said, if you can find this person, I'll get you an ice cream cone. And we all scattered and started to find this one tombstone because, then it gives you more information about your family if you can find these tombstones in cemeteries. And he tells me this story of one time he did this, and he heard me just screaming and running throughout this cemetery. And what I had been doing is I had been looking, and then I found a bee, of course. A bumblebee had found me and chased me throughout this cemetery, which is very reverent, remember, just the reverence of that moment. I'm screaming and running and doing all these things, and then he finally calms me down and realizes that the one cemetery tombstone that I had sat down on as he calmed me down was the very one we were looking for. Just a funny moment in this, and I got ice cream that day, by the way, because I was the lucky one to find it. Of course, nowadays you have technology. You have 23andMe and Ancestry.com, and people are finding all of these different things. And I wonder for a moment, why? What does this matter to people? And as a young person, for the longest time, I really didn't get it. Now, as I've gotten older and I have kids and we're aging and getting older, I want to know my family of origin. It starts to matter. But I remember thinking, what is the point? Like, who cares? Right? Why would you spend money to ship your DNA across the globe and find out, like, you're from Europe? Oh, okay. Or you're from South America. Great. I don't know. It's just, I never understood the purpose. And the more I've understood my own family of origin and started to ask questions that I'd never asked before, the more I realize how much of who I am today comes from that family. That family tree points you to who you are today. And it is easier to know where we're going because of our knowledge of where we've come from. And that's the whole point of this series, is we're going to be looking at Genesis chapters 1, 2, and 3 and learning about who we are. Who are we as people? Who are we as God's people? Who is the God that we worship? And so over the next few weeks, we're going to look at Genesis chapter 1, chapter 2, and chapter 3. And we're going to cover some topics of creation, Sabbath, identity, and sin. And looking at this and asking big questions of what does this teach us, not just about history, but who we are and who our God is. Now, this morning, or today, we're going to start looking at creation and Genesis chapter 1. And this is a very familiar story. If you've been in church or you grew up in church, you might even be over familiar with it. And I want to just test our knowledge of Genesis chapter 1 and the creation story. And so in just a moment, you're going to pause the video. Thankfully, we're in video mode. You can hit pause. And I want you to draw this graph or this chart that you see. And what I want you to do is just fill in the blanks with what you remember happened on each day. Let's just jog your memory, test your knowledge. And what I want you to do is just mark that out or fill those in. And you see the answers below the chart there in that picture. Right now, just hit the pause button on your video feed, get a scrap piece of paper, and just kind of mark out and test your knowledge for a moment. Let's test ourselves. Let's quiz ourselves, see how we remember this story. Awesome. Okay, well, now that you've unpaused it, I want you to just take a second here and let's look at what the answers were. Let's throw them up. There's the real answers for you. Day 1, 2, and 3. You see the different things, the heavens and the earth, the light and the darkness, the day and the night. Day 2 was the sky and that separated the water in the heavens. Then day 3, the land and the vegetation, the plants, things like that. Some scholars look at that and they see the first 3 days develop these areas, these realms, these inhabiting spaces, if you will, whether it be the heavens and the skies and the sea and the land. And then the next 3 days, day 4, 5, and 6, you see the things that God created that inhabited those spaces. So if it was the heavens and the cosmos, what you see is that God then created the sun and the moon and the stars in day 4. Then in day 5, you see that he fills the sky and the seas with fish and birds. And then in day 6, he creates the animals and the people that inhabit the land. The point of this is not to just feel like smarter Christians. The point of this is to help us realize that we may think we're really familiar with these origin stories and these moments, but there's still more to be gained. And it's not just facts and information, but I want us to be stirred to think about these things and to be challenged about these things from a new perspective. And part of that, even right now, is just how you would read Genesis chapter 1. A lot of times we've grown up learning from this historical standpoint. You filled out charts like you just did and tried to match what happened to each thing. And it kind of reinforces that idea of it being this historical document. It's very linear, pragmatic, and literal in how we read Genesis chapter 1. A lot of scholars would argue that. And then you're going to find that there's other scholars that look at Genesis chapter 1 and then they would say it's not intended to be read as this literal, historical, factual document in that way where it's meant to be used as very pragmatic and linear. I'm not saying that it's not true. Don't mishear me on that. But they would say it's less of a historical document type of writing and more of a poetic, literary type of writing, more of a way of helping the audience hear the truth of who God is in a way that is going to be memorable, in a way that flows. And as you read it with that kind of poetry lens, that kind of literary lens, you begin to notice some of the repetition, some of the patterns, some of the writing. That 6 times you're going to see repetition of the phrase that God saw it and it was good. 10 times you're going to see that it says God said, or that marks the end of each day very poetically and with imagery and repetition and all of these things, that whatever was created, and it says the day and the night, and then that marked day 5 or day 6. Why are we challenged to maybe even think about why or how we look at these texts? Because if we look at it just as a historical document, we're going to look at it as something as an artillery to argue or to defend our faith or to prove or disprove maybe science or somebody else's beliefs. And I think when Moses, who is believed to be the author, writes it, it's intended to help the audience understand the God that created everything. Not to create a blueprint for apologetics and proving and disproving science and arguing in that way. It's intended for us to read these things, to remember these things. The ancient audience that read or more often heard these things, because they weren't readers in the same way we are now. They weren't Googling these things. They were hearing the heart of God. They were hearing the character of God. And as we look at Genesis chapter 1, that's exactly what I want us to see. What does this teach us about God? What does this reveal to us about the Creator God? Let's look at this together. Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 through 31. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was formless and empty, and darkness covered the deep waters. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. And then God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw that the light was good. And then he separated the light from darkness, and he called the light day, and the darkness night. And evening passed, and morning came, marking the first day. Verse 6, then God said, "Let there be a space between the waters to separate the waters from the heavens and the waters from the earth." That is what happened. God made this space to separate the waters of the earth and the waters of the heavens. And God called it sky. And the evening passed and the morning came, marking the second day. Then God said, "Let the waters beneath the sky flow together in one place, so dry ground may appear." And that is what happened. God called the dry ground land and the waters seas, and God saw that it was good. And then he said, "Let the land sprout vegetation, every sort of seed-bearing plant and trees that grow seed-bearing fruit. These seeds will then produce the kinds of plants and trees from which they came." And that is what happened. The land produced vegetation and all sorts of seed-bearing plants and trees and seed-bearing fruit. And the seeds produced plants and trees of the same kind. And God saw that it was good. And evening passed and morning came, and it marking the third day. Then God said, let lights appear in the sky to separate the day from night. Let them be signs to mark the seasons, days, and years. And let these lights be the sky. Let these lights in the sky shine down on the earth. And that is what happened. God made these two great lights, the larger one to govern the day and the smaller one to govern the night. And he made the stars, and God sets these lights in the sky to light the earth, to govern the day and the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And evening passed and morning came, and the marking of the fourth day. Then God said, let the waters swarm with fish and other life, and the skies be filled with birds of every kind. So God created great sea creatures and every living thing that scurries and swarms in the water, and every sort of bird, each producing offspring of the same kind. And God saw that it was good. And then God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply. Let the fish fill the seas and the birds multiply on the earth. And the evening passed and the morning came, marking the fifth day. And then God said, let the earth produce every sort of animal, each producing offspring of the same kind, livestock, small animals that scurry on the ground, and wild animals. And that is what happened. And God made all sorts of wild animals, livestock, and small animals, each being able to produce offspring of the same kind. And God saw that it was good. Verse 26, then God said, let us make human beings in our image, to be like us. They will reign over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, the livestock, all the wild animals on the earth, and all the small animals that scurry along the ground. So God created the human beings in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. And then God blessed them and said, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and govern it, reign over the fish in the seas and the birds in the sky and all the animals that scurry along the ground. And then God said, look, I have given you every seed-bearing plant throughout the earth and all the fruit trees for your food. And I have given you every green plant as food for all the wild animals and the birds in the sky and the small animals that scurry along the ground. Everything that has life. And that is what happened. Then God looked over all that he had made, and he saw that it was very good. And evening passed and morning came, marking the sixth day. We made it. That was a big text. That was a lot to digest and take in, and there was an intentionality. I really didn't want to summarize. I didn't want to skip over that text. I wanted us to dive in because I think it's important for us to revisit the words that God inspired the author to write here, telling us of the creation story. And as you're reading this, I do believe the author wants us to see more of who our God is. What are we supposed to gain about who our God is from the creation story? Let's think about that for a few moments and think about, as we look at all 6 days being told and we're looking at all these things that happen, what does it teach us about our Creator God? One thing that I think it teaches us is that he is permanent. We see that God is permanent. The author jumps right in where God is already in existence at the beginning. You notice at the beginning, this is the beginning of when creation started, not the beginning of when God existed. So at the beginning, God is already present. What does that teach us? God is there from the beginning. God is there all the time. He is permanent. So the beginning of formation, the author isn't trying to prove God's existence. To the generations that would hear this story and then read the story and understand the story, is not about proving that God existed before the cosmos. It is about saying, at the very beginning of creation, God was already there. That's the given. It's to be understood. What does that show us about our God? Is that he is permanent. He is enduring. He is endless. He is not going to just disappear. He was not created by any other thing. He was in existence at that time. He is permanent. What else do we see about our God? We see that he's powerful. Our God is powerful. Creation is a result of God, not anything else. It is a creation of God's power and the existence of God bringing those things into existence, right? Notice that none of the material was pre-existing. It says that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So all matter, all material, all things, everything that is in existence today comes from what? Comes from God. All of creation, all material, all matter, everything is rooted in Him. It comes from Him. It is showing us the very power of the God that we worship, is that everything that we have and everything that we see and everything that we are is not some random combustible experiment gone wrong and haywire. It is all rooted from the Creator. In other religions and other ancient traditions and stories about creation, often in folklore and mythology and different things of that nature, you would see the gods, there were multiple gods, and they would have to fight to subdue nature. They would have to toil and somehow violently subdue nature and the elements of nature to somehow bring about the existence of these different things, to create the sun or the stars or the skies or anything in that nature. And yet, when we look at the text, what do we see? God existed and God created. And the power of God is not through violence, it is not through submission, it is not through Him bending these elements or forcing them into existence. It very simply and repeatedly said on multiple times, it said it 10 times. What did it say? God said. All God had to do was speak. Think of how powerful our God is that to bring light into existence, He didn't have to force all the electrons and cosmos and everything and somehow subdue them. He just spoke and said, let there be light. He just said, let's fill the earth with vegetation. He just said, let's create man in our image. He just spoke. And these things, these elements, these parts of our creation story were created because it shows the power of our God. That word of even Him speaking it is translated as He willed it, He decreed it, He appointed it, that He spoke and results occurred. Again, I think it just shows the true power of our God, that our God is not just permanent and endless and enduring, but our God is powerful. Our God is powerful. The last thing that we can see in this creation story about our God is that we see that God is pure. Every day that God made something, what was His response? It is good. 6 times He says it's good. In fact, the last day, what does He say? As He kind of steps back and sees everything, He says it is very good. Right? And what does that show you? God makes things that are good. Our God is not evil, broken, corrupt, and insecure. He's not creating things that He then needs to perfect along the way. He has created this environment. He's created this earth and the cosmos and humanity and animals and vegetation and everything. And when He steps back and looks at it, He doesn't say, man, that's messed up. I still got some work to do. Right? I got to finish some things up along the way. He steps back and looks at it and says, that's good. That's very good. This is incredible. What does it show? It shows the perfection of what God was designing. It shows that when He was in this moment of creation, He's creating paradise. He's creating something wonderful and beautiful and impeccable, and He's creating something that is pure. And it shows us the heart of God, which is good and pure and righteous. I think we forget about that because we look at our world today and it's broken. We see disease, we see disaster, we see suffering, we see tragedy, and we have a hard time thinking that God created something to be paradise. Because what we look at now is after the fall. Is after Adam and Eve in the garden making a willful choice and bringing upon itself consequences of that sin. We're going to talk about that in a couple weeks. But right now, at this moment in the story, at this moment of creation, at the origin story that we see, when God created the heavens and the earth, when He created what He has made, and we're reading about this, He looks back and He says, it is good. It is very good. It shows us how pure and how powerful, how permanent our God is. And then He gets to the pinnacle. He gets to the end result, and that's the story of humanity. In chapter 2 of Genesis, He's going to get into more detail, the author is, and talking more about the creation of man and woman and more details into that. But I think that it is something to take away, that as he creates humanity, that is kind of the end exclamation point. Not only is creation good, he says what? It is very good. And he's looking at all of this, and it poses the question for us to think about, because God is the creator, we are the creation. And why is it, this is a question I wrestled with this week, why is it important that we find this valuable? Why is it valuable to know that we are created and not just a byproduct of some random particle combustion? That we aren't just some boom, we're just, genes and matter and DNA and all of this that just happens. But we are created, we are formed, we are intricately knit together. Why is that valuable for us to understand from this text? That humanity was not just thrown together on the sixth day to, well, we got nothing else to do. It's that God looked at what he had created, and he created mankind to bear his image. He created mankind to represent him, to be in connection with him and be in community with him. And we read this text and we look at this, and we see a creator with his creation. Why is this valuable? I think it's valuable because you and I need to remember that we are not an accident. Sometimes along life in our journey, we're told we're an accident. We're in the way. We are a byproduct of circumstances. And yet when we read passages like Psalm 139, we see that we worship a God that he knew us in our mother's womb. He knit us together. He knows every beat of our heart, every hair on our head. He knows us so intimately and closely, and he has created us and crafted us and formed us. We bear his image. I think it's valuable for us to see in this text that when he steps back and says it's very good, he's proud of his creation. And some of us today need to be reminded, not only are we created with that kind of love and purity and power, that we serve a God that looks back and looks at you and says, I'm proud of you. I love you. You are not an accident. You are not just taking up space, but you are my son, you are my daughter, and I'm proud of you. I love you. I created you. You are my masterpiece. He is our creator. We are his creation. You see, as we look at the creation story, it's so much more than a Sunday school lesson. And sometimes with Genesis 1, we kind of turn it into that. We can picture the creation story. We can picture Sunday school. We can picture those moments. And we just imagine that, yeah, that's what it is. It's just this, almost folklore, mythology, or it's become something where we try to argue our point or argue our beliefs. And the whole story of creation is an origin story to remind us where we came from. It reminds us of the God that we worship. In ancient times, as you're reading throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament, I found it interesting that repeatedly throughout Scripture, they remind the people of God that God is their creator. That they constantly will draw back, and they'll be in the book of Exodus, or Moses will draw them back to the creation story. Joshua draws them back and says, guess what? We worship the God that created the heavens and the earth, right? Isaiah, Nehemiah, Jeremiah, all the way into the New Testament, you see Paul and you see Peter, you see John talk about it in John chapter 1, and he talks about the creation. And the creator God is the same creator God back then in the book of Genesis, in chapter 1, the creator God that created the heavens and the earth is the same God wherever you're at in this moment in history, at this moment of your journey. That's the same God. What does that mean for us today? The same God that created the heavens and the earth is the same God that we worship today. And Jeremiah needed to remind the people of Israel of that. Nehemiah needed to remind them. Joshua needed to remind them. Isaiah needed to remind them. Paul needed to remind them. John needed to remind them. And I believe that this morning you and I need to be reminded that God has not given up on us, that God is our creator God, and he is not just some distant folklore mythology God. He is right here with us, and he bears the same characteristics that we see in Genesis 1. He bears it today in 2020. He's pure. He's permanent. He's powerful. This is the God that we worship. We need to be reminded of these things. This is not just something of the past. This is what we need today. And this week, I think it bears that out even more. How many of us need our Creator God to show up? How many of us this week wrestled with our faith? Wrestled with stress and anxiety and fear? I had people reach out to me and say, Sean, this is a trying time. I've never seen anything like this in my lifetime. With all that is happening in our culture, and life is shutting down outside of our walls, and sports are shutting down, and governments are going through chaos and asking, and we're seeing all of this turmoil. We're seeing confusion. We're seeing all of this panic and everything that's happening. How many of us need to just stop and remember the God that we worship? The Creator God that we worship is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And then amidst all this confusion and chaos and suffering and difficulty, He's the same God. He is powerful. He is permanent. He is pure. And I'm praying for us as a church. I'm praying for us as a community. I'm praying for our world as it's in these moments that people question their faith. It's in these moments that people run to something bigger than themselves and begin to ask questions. And I don't think it's an accident that God had put it on our teaching calendar to put this together, and it stirred my heart months ago that we need to be talking about this at this time. Why? Because when life feels bigger than anything we can handle, we need to run to a God that is bigger than anything we can handle. We need to know that God is big enough. You and I need to remember the God that we worship is bigger than anything we're going through right now. He is big enough, and He has us in our hands. That He's powerful enough, that He's good enough and pure enough, permanent, that He will endure, that His truth will endure, that His people will endure. Church, I wish we could be together today. I wrestled with a lot of these points of tension, and I wish in these moments we could be together, because it's in these moments that we realize we want to be around the people we love the most. We want to hug each other. We want to hold each other. We want to pray for each other. We want to support each other in these ways. And my prayer is that during this time, we recognize that the church is still the church, even though we don't gather in our church building. We are still the people of God. And we can still serve each other and love each other and support each other and encourage one another in a variety of different ways. And it's not restricted to this building. But what brings us together, what makes us the people of God is not where we gather. It's the God that we worship. And we worship a God that is big enough. We worship a God that is going to endure. He's powerful enough, and He's pure enough, and He loves you, church. I want you to know during this time, as we are scattered throughout our community and unable to gather in the same way that we're used to, I want you to remember that you are loved, and we're here for you. And first and foremost, God is with you. He has not abandoned you. He is not passive. He is not powerless. But He's with you right where you're at. And as we pray in just a second, I want you to know that the same God you pray to in this building that I'm standing in is the same God that's right there with you in your living room or in your bedroom or in your car. And He created you, and He's walking with you on this journey. We love you, church. Let's pray. God, I thank you for who you are. I thank you that in the midst of everything that happens and when our world gets turned upside down, we can look to the God that created the world. We can look to our Creator. We can look to you because you can be the rock that we find steadiness. You can be the one that we find wholeness and truth and stability in when everything else is unsettled. I pray that we depend on you. I pray, Jesus, that during this time you help us to learn what it means to trust you. That we would be your people who trust you. Trust you with our whole lives. Trust you with everything that we are. Trust you with our futures. Trust you with this moment. We just begin to really trust you. Develop our faith. Grow us as followers of you during this time. We love you, and we thank you for loving us. In your name we pray. Amen. Amen.
Just below where this video is posted, you can download a reading and reflection bookmark or phone wallpaper. This will allow us to continue to engage with the series during the week. Read the passage, reflect on the question provided, journal, discuss, or pray about it. Please stay connected as we're no longer gathered but scattered into our homes. Visit our Share and Connect portal to let us know any prayer requests, any physical needs you have, or any concerns or feelings you'd like someone to talk with you about. Our team would love to stay connected with you. To access this form, there's a link at the bottom of the Church at Home website or on our homepage at thehubcitychurch.com. Thanks for watching and having church at home.